So I'm going to create a new workspace, and a workspace is just a place where you store things. Let's call this London Business Analytics Group. And within this, I'm going to create a lake house. So bear with me, but a lake house is basically somewhere that you can store things. You can store data. It sits in the service, so anyone that has access to this workspace can actually use it. Now, what Microsoft have done is Microsoft have created a OneLake that you can actually download from Microsoft Download. So you can download a OneLake, and I've got the link to it on my machine. But you can see on here, this is my file explorer, and it will sync to my OneLake, my work service. So at the moment, I haven't got a London Business Analytics Group folder. But when I click on my OneLake, let's just go up one, and there's my OneLake. And if I click on it and click on OneLake, sync from OneLake, you'll see that when I open it, the London Business Analytics Group comes up, which is incredibly useful because what I can do now is I can see my lake house, and I can open it and I can see that there are files and there are tables. So within the lake house, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull over a file that I've got on my desktop called HR file. And I'm going to pop it in here. Oh, that's useful. Bear with. So copy, and let's just paste it in there. So you can see I've got a HR file.csv in there. Now, when I sync my workspace, you will see, just give it 1 second, that my HR file is in there. So I haven't had to install Python at all. I've got Python set up and it's actually working on my machine. So let me just pull this over. So I've got Python working on my machine, and this is one of the really nice things about using either Google Colabs, or now we can use it in Microsoft, is that you don't have to install and have an install of Python sat on your local machine, because that can be quite messy. So now that I've got this data in here, I've got this open notebook. So if I click on open notebook up here, I can open a new notebook. So within a couple of minutes, I've actually got a notebook that's opened and that's working within within my install of Python, install of Microsoft. So I've got this folder here, and it's got my new notebook. Now, all I have to do is to click on these 3 buttons. And this is brilliant, and click load data. And somebody asked before about Spark. You can load it using Spark, but because I'm going to be going through data analytics, I'm going to be using Pandas to show you data analytics within Python. So if I click on Pandas, you can see that it's written the code for me. So if I press play, you can note that I've pulled in a library called Pandas, and I will go through. Don't worry if you don't understand what a library is yet, I will explain it. It starts up my instance, and you can see Apache Spark's working. I've got PySpark using Python. I've ported in my library, and straight away I've got my data set in there. So I've got some columns in there, number of projects, and I've got my data loaded as a data frame called DF. So DF, so we're displaying DF. But before I move into this, I'm just going to change the view so that we can have the view as side by side so that you'll be able to see. And I'm going to minimize this and make it F11. So hopefully it should make it really nice and easy for you to be able to use and see it. Because there's nothing worse than if you can't see a demonstration. So not only are we going to look at Pandas and Python, I'm going to show you a little bit about notebooks and how they work. So this is a cell within a notebook, and if you hover underneath, you can see that you can either add in code, and this is code, so it's running our code, or we can have markdown. And markdown is a particular way of adding text to your code, which enables you to explain what's happening. And this is particularly useful if you're working with a team and you want to make notes about something, like this is looking a bit funny, can you check this out, can we ask the customer, is this what they're looking for? So it's a way that you can either explain your analysis or you can make notes to yourself. So within Markdown, you can see we can actually make things bold, italic, we can change the style, we can even add in images and make it bullet points and have an ordered list. So this is the aim of my session, so it's making it very clear what I want to do. Now, the first thing that we do when we start writing code, and a few of you will probably smile when you see this, is the key common thing, and I know Mark will smile, is we say, hello world. Whichever code that you write in, usually the first thing that we type is hello world. So you can see the output being generated over here. A couple of things. If we're writing Markdown, which means that the text is being printed as part of the output of our notebook. Within our cell, we might want to write comments that we don't actually want to be visible, but we still want to be able to use them. So we use a hashtag, that's how we write a comment, and a hashtag, and this is my other comment. In this, if you press enter, it allows you to enter data within a cell. Shift and enter allows you to enter the cell. So you press shift and enter, or you can press play, and then you can see that it's working. The other thing which I think is particularly useful is when you are writing print, so you can see print, and you'll have to excuse me because I've got a bit of a cough. /n here allows you to add in a new line within the speech marks. So /n, if I print this, we'll put in a new line. A backslash there allows us to escape any special characteristics. I put that in because I remember one afternoon spending forever trying to before ChatGPT was in the world, trying to find out exactly what the code was. So that just gives you a little bit of understanding about how to print and format your text. I'm also just going to show you and point you towards a resource which is really useful, and I found quite useful, about how to document your code. So Seattle Data Guy is a data scientist and he writes some excellent content, but he's got a 3-part series about notebooks and how to document your code for data analytics, which is really useful. Just another little point, after the full stop, you have to put 2 spaces for it to write in a new line, or you use the break character there, and that will then put in a new line here and a new line here, which then makes your code a little bit nicer. So if you're going to be writing Python, I think most things now tend to be using a notebook, so it's quite handy to understand how they work. So let's get into some key programming constructs within Python. So what we're saying here, this is our general if statement. So I'm starting slow, and then I'll build up with speed. Python uses spaces as a form of indentation. So on here, I'm basically using my if statement. I've got my colons and I've got a print. If I come back, you can see there's a squiggle, and it'll tell me that there's a problem. And it will come up with an error, and it's quite good at actually now telling you what the error is. But if we press backspace and then return, it automatically indents it for you. So it's not only to make it look nice, but it actually is required for part of the programming language. So if we've got an if statement, we then want to have an if and an else. So use of an if uses to the if and the else. So if it's 5 is greater than 2, then it's yes, else it's no. But it's always going to be, isn't it? 5 is always going to be greater than 2. So we might want to start looking at variables here. And I have written all of this code out in another notebook, which is in the GitHub for you. So don't worry about trying to keep hold of this. It is in the GitHub, so you'll be able to follow it. But you seriously don't want to be watching me type code out, because one, I'll make a mistake, and two, will take forever. So a little word about variables. In Python, a variable is created the moment that you assign a value to it. In some other languages, what you have to do is you have to create the variable first. You have to create an instance of the variable before you can use it. Within Python, you don't have to do so. And those are the rules that just give you an idea about what you can and can't do when you start using your variables. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a little bit of code, and we're just going to say, okay, show us a variable. So we've created a variable called A and one called B, and we said if A is greater than 5, then yes, duh, otherwise print no. So if I get rid of the 2, you can see that it will then yes, duh. So it's a simple if and else statement. And just a note, as you hover over the cells, you can move them up and down, so you can change them around and you can change the order of your cells. Careful when you do so, because when you run your code, you can only refer to variables and things once they've been created, after they've been created. So I can't call A here if I haven't created A. So when you start moving things around, just be a little bit careful or use a bit of caution. So we usually have 3 conditions. So in Python, if you use Power Query, and apologies if you don't, but if you use Power Query, it's if, else, then. If you use another language, it can be something else. But within Python, we use if, then we use, for the cases in between, the end case, we use elif, so else if. So we'll say if the number is greater than threshold, print the number. If the number is the equivalent of threshold, print this. So if I press play, you'll see we can actually start to create our variables and change our variables, and create our output will change accordingly. So this then leads us on to think about functions. So I've created my my code, and what I might want to do is I might want to say, well, actually, I don't want to write this out every time I want to compare 2 things. I might want to create a little function. So once I've created a function, then I can just call my function. So to create a function in Python, you use the def with a space, and then your compare values with your number and your threshold. And the commenting is really nice in this. It gives you an idea of exactly what's happening within your notebook. And you can see here we've got the 3 speech marks. The 3 speech marks allows us to write several lines of code. So now if I press play, you can see we've got our compare values. So now if I want to call it, and it's quite nice because the IntelliSense just kicks in for us, which really helps us. We can press 5 out of 10 and our code will run. So I'm sure you can all think of different examples of functions that would make life easier for you. So we've covered if statements, we've covered functions, and we've covered variables. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start looking at lists and for statements. So let me pop this in. And I hope I'm not going too fast, but I hope that is that okay? Okay, thank you. It's difficult when you don't see the chat, but yeah, I saw the, thanks, Mark. I can't see the chat. Good. So good. Okay, brilliant. So what you can do is you can define a list of numbers. So our numbers is our list, and we use some square brackets with the commas to actually separate each item in our list. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a for loop to iterate over the list. So we say for number, and number it doesn't have to be called number, it could be called anything. But what we're saying for number, which is basically saying for every item in our list called numbers, what I want you to do is double each item by 2, and I'm going to call that item doubled. So we're creating a we're creating some code really. And then what I'm doing is I'm saying print. And if you remember, when we print before, we put it in, if you can look up here, it's in speech marks, but number is an integer and doubled is an integer. So one way, the old way of doing it is we would do print, and if I press, I've pulled it out so you can see. So we're saying make number a string, and then here we do a plus, not a ampersand, a plus. Doubled is and a plus, and then string doubled. Whereas what we can do, there's this new, it's fairly new ability to use, and they're called I think it's F strings. Yes, Smart's nodding, F strings. So F strings are brilliant because you don't have to change the text. You don't have to change the data type of what you're actually pulling into your print statement. You just put an F in front. So you've got your speech marks. So that's saying I want you to print that. So we're meeting the Python syntax. And the number is still a number, but because it's in those speech marks, because it's in this curly braces, it's allowing it to retain its case, which means that it's quicker to evaluate it. And you don't have to do the plus sign, so it makes it much, much quicker and simpler. And there's no difference in the output, but it's just quicker. So if you can think, if you're dealing with, massive rows of data or more complex things, it's much, much more straightforward to be able to do this. So that's an example of a for statement. What I want to go through now is a while statement. So these are basic key coding constructs. So if we click at code and press this, what we're going to do is we're going to initialize a counter variable. So we've got a variable and it's starting at 5, and we've just called it counter because it's quite nice to call things what you want them to be, because it helps with the logic when you're thinking about it. So what we're saying is, while this counter is greater than 0, and this is where the indentation is really important, because it's saying these 3 lines belong to this while loop. So while counter is greater than 0, so counter is 5, what we want you to do is print countdown. I'm just going to put a little space, and then the counter. So it would put countdown 5, then it would decrease the counter by 1. So this count minus equals 1 is the equivalent of counter equals counter minus 1. So it's just a quick and easy way to do it. So when we take 1 from 5, it's 4, so it'll keep going. Then it'll be 3 and it'll keep going. Then 2, it'll keep going. Then 1, then keep going. And then when it gets to 0, it's not true anymore. So when it's not true, it then prints liftoff. It moves out of the while loop. So if we press play here and run the cell, and you can see when it runs, it gets a little tiny little asterisk so that you know that it's working. So it counts down and then it prints liftoff. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you another method of using a while loop, but this is using a break. So at this point, we know that we want it to go for 5 because our counter is 5. It might be sometimes you don't actually know what you're starting with, but you get to a point at which you want it to end. So here we're starting another variable and we're calling it 0. It could call it anything. We're saying whilst true. So this was checking each time that it was true. This is saying while it's true. Well, the number is while it's true, so number plus equals 1, so we're going to have a 1, and then it's going to check, is it greater than 5 or equal to 5? No, it's not, so let's go back, and then it will keep going until the number is greater than or equal to 5, and then it will break. So there are just 2 key ways that you can think of having a loop that would iterate over your data continuously. So here, what's quite useful, what's incredibly useful, is to actually add in some error catching. So I've got a session in my user group by Christian, one of our key contributors, on error catching in Power Query, if anyone's interested. But it's so important because things can happen and then they stop your code working. So you always need to think about what could possibly go wrong. And for this, all I did is I copied this, I popped it into ChatGPT and I said, tell me what could go wrong. So ChatGPT, as long as you know enough to know what to have a discussion with it, then I think it's quite useful to be able to use. So it said to me, well, it could go wrong if it's an integer, or it's if it's not an integer, or it's negative, which obviously makes sense because, you know, if it's negative or an or a, you know, alphanumeric or alphabet, then it's not going to work. So if I press play here, this will work and it will go through it because it's fine. Now, if I change this counter and make it, say, A to text, it's going to give us an error. And it should say, actually, it's a value error. So we can say, you're giving us the wrong thing. It's not only just telling us what's wrong, it's telling us it's a value error. So what you're putting in is wrong. And this is really handy when you're building code to actually put in an error to help the user understand what the problem is. And you can see there's a cross. So I tend to find, again, it's once you sort of know a little enough, then you can work out what's happening. And what you can do if you use ChatGPT is you can put your code in and you can put the error in and you can say, explain to me what's gone wrong. And it's pretty good at doing so. So not that things go wrong for me often, honestly, but it is quite helpful to put it in.
So 30 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm on time, so we're good. So what we've gone through now is we've looked at using notebooks. I've given you an introduction to notebooks. I've given you some basic Python programming constraints. We've looked at variables, ifs, for statements and while statements. So now I want to move on to the next part of our session, which is looking at libraries. So excuse me, we'll just have a sip. I woke up on Saturday morning with a cough, which is not what you want when you're about to deliver sessions and talk to people. So I'm trying to keep the cough under control. So in the same way that we've used print and we've used some key Python terminology, what we can do is we can start to call in libraries. And libraries, if you think of Excel, I just want to show a small version of Excel. If you think of formulas, all of our formulas are grouped according to different bits that you can do with them. And libraries, I think it helps to think of exactly in the same way. They're basically just groups of functions that you can pull in that help you do things to those functions. So within IPython.display, we can import the display module, and we're using HTML. Now, you probably wouldn't use this, maybe you would, it depends what your code's doing. I wouldn't imagine it's highly relevant with data analytics, but for some things that it might be. But it's always useful to understand how a library works. So I've got my while loop going there, and you'll see at the bottom I've got some code. So because I've imported in this library, it gives me the ability to use the HTML code, and I can use my bold styling, and I can set my font size to be 20 pixels. So as I print, we can add a little bit of formatting in there, which is quite a nice thing to be able to play with. So now I'm going into the powerhouse that is NumPy. And let me just pull in NumPy. So NumPy performs the backbone for many of the other libraries. So you might not necessarily see us call NumPy, but it's there in the background and it's built into Pandas. So within Pandas uses NumPy, but it's quite often built in. So sometimes, most of the time, you don't necessarily have to call it to actually make it work, but I always put it in because it's there then in case you're asking Pandas to do something which isn't built in from its general knowledge of NumPy. For some of your scientific calculations, it's good just to have NumPy there in case you're asking it to do something you don't want it to do. And NumPy, basically, it's a way of handling arrays, which apologies if you're not a Power Query person, but it's lists. So it's a way of handling lists or columns of data from Excel. So let me give you an example. So this might be something that you would actually use. So we've imported Pandas before, but we can import it again. We're going to import NumPy as MP, and as you hover over it, you can see it gives you some documentation and it tells you what it is. Now, within here, I'm creating my own little data frame, my own table of information, where this is the column header and these are the rows. So if I press play, you'll see that I've got a DF weather, it's called DF weather. And as I hover over it, it gives me information about the data frame. But now, because I've created a data frame, there are things that I can do to it that are utilizing the Pandas library. So we can see two things to point out. Pandas index starts at 0. So all of our counting starts at 0. And when we want to refer to a location of something within Pandas, we look at the row first and then the column. So 20 would be 0, 1, 0, 0. So it would be this particular instance here, and that enables us. So it's rows first, then columns. So when you're starting to want to locate things, and I've got a few examples, we use the row columns. So here, this is an example of what we can do. And although I've got a really small data frame for this example, this would work for millions of rows of data. It's very, very quick. So I just want to draw your attention to the syntax. So we didn't have a column called temperature Fahrenheit, but now we do. And all we've had to do to create that column is you've used our data frame, and then we've added the 2 square brackets within it, and we've put the name, and then we've put equals, and we're calling our other temperature, our other column, and then we're doing some mathematical equations to it. So we're timesing by 9/5 and then adding 32, which then it just iterates over each row and does that particular calculation. And it might be that what we might want to do is we might want to say, well, actually, let me save this. I've done what I need. So this is an example of how you can save, and I'll show you at the end. This will be saved back into our library. So you'll see we can save, export out. So in the same way that we read a CSV, we can use a to CSV to actually save to our files. And remind me at the end, and I'll show you that it's actually worked. So let's show you how to filter. So let's roll up. So here, what we're doing is we're going to filter where the humidity is greater than 40. So I'm expecting to get 2 rows. Now, if we look at the syntax for high humidity, because we're giving a different name, we're calling a different name, we're creating another data frame object in the same way that we use df weather temperature F to create another column. Here, we're not changing our original data frame, but we're creating a new one, and we're saying, so that's why it's called a new name. Then our first square bracket is applying our filter context, where we're saying, right, okay, all I want from this data frame are the rows that are greater than 40. So it applies a Boolean mask, a true false mask to these particular rows. So this is false, this is false, this is false, true, true. So it says, okay, let's filter by those that are only true and apply that to those rows and select only those rows. So when I press play, you'll see it's then filtered those 2 rows. So it just explains how you can use the 2 square brackets to actually filter and apply some filter context. So hopefully what we should be able to do now is start to go back to this, this data set that we pulled in with our HR data, where we're looking at, well, in fact, let's just show you what we're looking at. So if you remember at the beginning, and this is if there wasn't quite so many of you, I'd say, what's it called? And you'd put it all in the chat for me, but I won't get caught up because I won't finish on time. And if I don't finish on time, then I'll be in trouble because I always make everybody finish on time. So I have to live by my own motto. So if we do display DF, then that's actually showing our data frame. This is the original HR data frame that we pulled in. So we can see we've got 15,000 rows of data. We've got data about our satisfaction level, and these are all of our columns, and you can see it shows the first 5 and the last 5. It's also quite handy. Let me just show you a few of the key, so you have to scroll down a bit. Let's show you a few of the key things that we can do. So we can say print, and we can do df.head, and I bet you can guess what this is going to do. This is going to print the head of the data frame. So it's quite nice because we can see the columns and we can see the head. The default is 5, but if you wanted more, you could put in 10 and it would print 10 off for you. You can also put in tail to show the bottom of your data frame. So that will show you the bottom of your data frame. And it might be, actually it might help if I press play. There. You can see, and we've got the row index there. But you might say, well, actually, if that's the head and the bottom, show me a random sample. So this is where you can put in a code for the random sample. So we're saying, again, we've got our df.sample. We've got our method here, which is pulling from our pandas data frame. And we can tell how many we want it to pull in. Now, just think, all we've got at the top is we've got one reference to the file that we're bringing in. So we could set up our own EDA, our own exploratory data analysis using DF, where we can just have this notebook running where we pull in the head, the tail, the size of the data set, show me some sample, and we could run this on any particular data set that we pull in. It's the only thing that would change would be the source of data that you pull in. So what we might say is, well, okay, I've got an idea of the information. And I mean, at the moment, we're only dealing with 10 columns, but it could be you could have 200 columns. So you could say, give me a concise summary. So within this concise summary, we've got each column, we've got how many are non-null, and we've got our data types, and we've got a summary at the bottom of the different data types. So that's quite a nice way that we can actually just start to get a feel for our data before we start looking at it fully. What's also very useful is this df.describe. This gives us the descriptive statistics of each of the numerical columns that we have within our data frame. So it'll show us the mean, standard deviation, the different quartile information, and the maximum. And so it's quite useful to be able to use. We can also, if we've got many columns, we can say, oh, just give me a breakdown of the particular columns. You know, I don't want to look at the data as such yet. What I want to see is the particular column names. And we can see this is an index, which is an object. And because it's an object of our data frame, we can do things with it. So what we could do is we could create it as a list. So we can send it to a list. So we can have a list of our columns. And once we have a list of our columns, then we can do all sorts of things with our lists. So you could sort your list. Sorted equals true, reverse equals true, and might help if I got it to And you can see it's really nice because it recognizes what variables you've got or what objects you've got. And then it will print them out for me. So obviously we've got the reverse equals true. If I get rid of that, I think the default is ascending and press play. You can see that it'll come out that way. That's interesting. Now, what we might want to do is here, we might decide that we want to iterate over our column names to give us a list of the data types within the columns. So it can go through and it can actually say, you know, what type of data type it is. So it's quite useful if you're doing your exploratory and you've got many different types of columns. And you could look at all of that and say, right, okay, satisfaction level. What I'm really interested in from my customers is, or my employees, is how satisfied they are. So you can hear, and this is where you're using NumPy, you're pulling a column of data out and you're actually saying, show me the descriptive statistics of this. So we can see, you know, that some are 100%, you know, what's the standard deviation, what's the average, and the different quartiles. So you can start to, depending upon what the need for your data analysis is, you can pull out different columns. And I'm going to show you shortly how you can visualize that. You might have noticed that monthly has got a H missing from it. So this is a way, we've got another method that we can actually add where we can say, let's change that name. And instead of calling it monthly, let's have a H in it. And in place equals true means change it within our data frame. So it will automatically overwrite it within our data frame. Another thing that we can do, which is quite useful, is we can create a copy of our data frame. So let me just show you here. So within our data frame, we can produce a copy. So it means that you can take your data frame and you can start to actually do things to it that isn't going to change your source data, because your source data is still in your files. It's not going to necessarily change some of the analysis that you've carried out, but you might want to do things with a particular subset of that data. And if it goes wrong, then at the top there's this run button. You can press stop, delete that cell, and then run it all again from the start. So you haven't got any problem then with you know, overwriting or making an error. So here, if we're creating a copy of our data frame, and then within that copy we're actually going to use an underscore, and we're going to get, because in if we're using Power BI, for example, we don't necessarily like our columns looking like this. It's much nicer to have a space and to have proper case so it looks good, rather than actually having it like this, whereas Python prefers not to have, and most other coding languages prefers not to have spaces within the names of the particular columns. So we're actually here, we're method chaining. So we've got our here we're replacing, and then we're adding onto it our title. So you can see there how you can do things. Another useful thing to be able to do is to check for missing values. So I don't know about you, but quite often the data comes to me and it's messy, it's got nulls, it's got errors, it's got all sorts of things going on with it. So within Pandas, we've got this opportunity to do df.isNull. So I can go through in each of my columns, I've asked it to add up and give me a summary of the number of null values. And then df.shape is also quite useful because it allows me to see the shape of my data. So by shape, I mean the number of rows and the number of columns. So satisfaction, the satisfaction level would be something that's particularly useful for me. So I might want to put in here and see, okay, show me, give me a summary, because it might be that I want to speak to the customer and just give them a brief analysis of their data set that they've given you to explain, you know, look, that, you know, your source data needs some cleaning up. you know, these are the things that I found. Is there a reason for this? How can we change it? How can we make it better? What do you want me to do about it before I carry on with my analysis? So we can just find out the number of nulls, the data type is, and so you can see we've got these printing where we'll be able to print out what is happening with our data set. So it allows us to decide what we want to do. And a customer might come.
13 minutes. My apologies,
Brilliant.
a bit late. 13 minutes.
Oh, don't worry, I'm nearly there. So the customer might come back and say, well, actually, let's delete them. So you can do delete. So you can go through and you can say, let's delete them. So we're just dropping them. So here we've got a drop NA where we can actually drop and then we can print it off. And so you might want to make it really clear for them, because we know it's 13075 and it was 1499. But again, if you've just got a basic data set, you might want to make it clear, because we're still using DF. So we can say the difference in the number of rows is 1924. So you're able each time to be able to, and these DFs are referring to whichever, I mean, the satisfaction level is different because the column names would change from a different data frame. But in this case, where you're just using DF, then this would be able to be transferable depending upon whatever data source that comes in. And so I'm just going to move on to now a little bit of visualization. So I should be about 5-ish minutes, I think, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. So you may have heard of Matplotlib. So Matplotlib is basically, it's really cool. It's basically the main visualization of pandas and Python, although I have got a little bit of Seaborn as well in there for you, which is another visualization library, which is used more for statistics. So what I'm doing is I'm doing my importing. Then I'm creating an array, a list of departments and how many rows there are for each, how many rows there are for the salary. And then I'm creating a figure. So that's my figure size. And within here, I've got a subplot. Now, do you remember when I said it was row column? So it's one row, two columns, first part of the first column. So it's creating a bar chart. It's telling me I'm putting the color in. I've got the title. I've got some, because the departments don't fit, I want a rotation. And here for the salary, one row, two columns, second place. You can see, so what it will do is it'll print off the two particular visuals.
10 minutes, Sue.
Perfect, thank you. So what I might also want to do is I might want to find out a little bit more about satisfaction and time spent in the company. So here, again, it's the same type of visual. I don't have to import in Matplotlib because I've already got it in there. I've created my figure size. I've picked out my 3 columns. I've said I want a box plot and I've put my title and my values. Tight layout sticks it together, and plt.show you always need at the end. And don't forget, you've got this. I've got this notebook for you. So if I am going a bit fast, you can always go over it in your own time. Hopefully it's not too fast for you, but if I am, then apologies. So on here, I thought that was a bit rubbish, so let's make it better. Let's have a bit of colour in there. So I've added a little bit of colour in there. I've made the titles at the top. I've made the median step out. So you can start. So you can start to see how you can start to improve. Now, I just want to show you a little bit about Seaborn, because Seaborn is another graphics package which is particularly useful. So let me just add some Seaborn. So satisfaction is what we're interested in. So if I press play, again, we've got our common code. We're importing our Seaborn library. We're setting our style to be white grid. And then within that style, we've got our figure size to be 12/6. We've got our box plot. So we've got our departments and our satisfaction level. And you can look at it and you can say, ooh, sales. So when we look at all of these, they're roughly is the same, but sales, there's a problem with satisfaction there. So you might think, well, okay, why is there a problem with satisfaction? So I won't go into this in too much depth, but the code will be available for you to look over it. So again, this is utilizing NumPy, which is brilliant. So we're pulling out our departments. We're saying, show me the ones that are sales, group by, here we go. And then I want to have a look at time spent with the company and the satisfaction level and what the average is. So we're then method chaining all of our work together. These are all things that we know what to do, but we can just add them on to each other. So if I, excuse me, if I press play, you can think, oh, so, okay, we've got sales compared to the rest. Sales is dropping right down at length of service compared to the overall. So people don't seem to be staying very long. So then when we go up here, we might say, okay, well, show me what's the difference, you know, what's the problem? Let's have a look at salaries. So if I put my other code in here where I'm pulling out my sales and my salary and the satisfaction, I want to plot by department, sales against everyone else. You can see that our sales is low, so they're all sat on a low salary level, which is why they're not very satisfied and which is why they leave early. So it might be worth then reviewing the amount that we pay our people. So what have we done and what have we gone through? So hopefully what I've been able to do is to give you an introduction to what Python is. I've given you some of the basics of the key programming constructs within Python. I've shown you that there are different libraries for NumPy and Pandas. We've touched on data cleaning, so we've looked at a little bit of how to get rid of null values and things like that. And we've brought in some visualization from Matplotlib. So I hopefully it's a very, very, very fast whistle-stop tour. I haven't seen any of the chat, so I have no idea whether it's worked for you or not. But
The
I
chat
shall
has
look
been
at
very appreciative.
Has it?
Yes.
So I hope that it's been useful for you, and I'll stop talking now. And shall I stop sharing my screen? So basically, that's me. If you're interested, please research and look up at me on LinkedIn, and you can connect with me there. And I hope that you've enjoyed the session.